My name is Ari Stein. I'm the lead curator for CogX. And I welcome you back to our second session of the day in Every Man to Screen. And to everyone in the virtual world, if you could just see how beautiful this cinema is. But I'm sure you're enjoying this the events from home as well. So there's a couple things just to really quickly get out of the way. If you can, if you're in the virtual world and in the room, keep an eye on the last 10 minutes of this session, and I encourage you to ask questions because that's where sometimes the most engaging content happens. And Lucy, our virtual moderator, will be helping everyone out with that. Tweet us at CogX 2021. It's a hybrid festival, so there's lots of different events and activities going on. And also just a huge shout out to our headline partners, Accenture, Visa, and Quantum Black for making this incredible event happen. Now, I'm very excited about this next session specifically because I actually live in Stockholm. Fredrik, who's about to appear online, and I use VOI every day. So I know it's been incredibly advantageous to my life. Everywhere I go, I use it. So I'm going to be very intrigued to hear what he has to say. So over to you, Lucy. We're going to be talking about mobility in cities. Thanks again. Give a round of applause.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone listening around the world. Welcome to this session on two-wheeled mobility and the city, brought to you live from King's Cross, Greenwich, and Stockholm. I'm really delighted to welcome our two speakers for this session. Really incredible forces for change in transport. Isabel Dedring, the Arup's global transport leader, former deputy mayor for transport in London and former deputy chair of Transport for London, and Fredrik Hjelm, CEO and co-founder of VOI Technology. In a second, I'll ask Isabel and Fredrik to give us a very quick 60-second introduction to their organisations. Then we'll have a discussion and there will be some time for questions at the end, I hope. So first of all, I'll hand over to Isabel. Isabel, please, could you give us a very quick overview of Arup and your interest in two-wheeled mobility?
Yeah, sure. So I look after the transport business at Arup. Arup's an engineering consultancy, but we do everything from project creation all the way through to strategy and policy, through to designing and building big structures. But more and more, of course, people are interested in walking, cycling, the green agenda, and we've seen a huge change in our client base over the last, I would say, even 12 months in a total shift into this space. So obviously that's all great news for Fredrik. And my background is 15 years in London government, including running the transport portfolio for the previous mayor. So we put in place the first cycle superhighways, as they were then called, the electric taxis, and started off the electric bus fleet conversion. So a lot of experience in that particular space. Over to you, Fredrik.
Excellent, great.
Thank you. Do you hear me?
Yep.
Great to meet you, Isabel, and great to meet you, Lucy. So yeah, I am CEO and founder of VOI Technology. Founded the company in Stockholm 2018, so we have been around for a bit more than 3 years. The vision we set out from day one was super simple: cities made for living, free from noise and pollution. I got the idea after living in Moscow for a couple of years, very congested, very polluted city, and going deeper into urban planning, urban transportation, and cities of the future. I just realized that cities can't look like Moscow did back then when I lived there 7-8 years ago. I think it's very stupid to move around people in heavy combustion engine cars in city centers. And now at VOI, we run Europe's biggest shared micromobility operations. So we run shared electric scooters, such as the one behind me here, and shared electric bikes as well. In UK, we are in just above 20 cities with our electric scooters and a couple of cities with our electric bikes. We also run the world's largest resale program for electric scooters, where we take our fleets, so our old generation vehicles, we refurbish them and then resell them to consumers and businesses. So I'm super happy to be here. And as Isabel said as well, the last year we have really seen cities all over Europe actually starting to take real actions towards their green visions, green agendas, green plans, building more bike infrastructure, subsidies for e-bikes, legalizing e-scooters in the UK, rental ones. So we're more hopeful today about the future than we were 1, 2, 3, 4 years ago.
Great, thanks, Fredrik. Thanks for that introduction. I want to ask you a little bit more about what you know about who is using the e-scooters and e-bikes that you operate. Isabel talked about some of her work, particularly in London, to introduce cycle infrastructure. We all know that in London we've had a conventional cycle share scheme for a long time now. What do you know about who's using newer schemes like the e-scooters and e-bikes that VOI operates? Do you see the same sorts of customers and the same sorts of journeys as these longer standing cycle share schemes in cities?
Great question. I think what we see overall is when e-scooters is a quite new thing. E-bikes is somewhat new things, but bikes have been around for a long time. So when we look at the demographic groups for our bikes, it's definitely broader. It's more female users. It's more It's more older users. When we look at our e-scooter schemes, basically when we come to a city with e-scooters, initially the first adopters are usually predominantly male, 25 to 34 years old. The longer we are in a city, and the more we kind of get accepted both from kind of non-users, users, the perception around safety and so on improves. Yet same there, the more female users we get and the more older users we get. So when we look at some of our more mature markets, say Stockholm, say Oslo in Norway, say some of the German markets, we see that we're moving more towards a 50-50 male-female split in our user groups, and also that the average user is around 35 to 40 rather than 25 to 34 that we see early on. And the biggest barriers to adoption and entry that we see is one, safety, both kind of actual safety and perceived safety, and then it's around pricing. And we have said that we exist partly to democratize micromobility, so we do everything we can to kind of give back cost efficiency improvements to the users through loyalty programs, subscriptions, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Great. And just as a follow-up question to that, how do you expect the adoption of e-scooters and e-bikes to change, to develop over the next 5 years? And where do you see the most potential for technology and innovation to affect that adoption?
I think my personal goal is that by 2030 we should be able to replace pretty much every or most trips done by cars in cities on shorter distances in cities all around the world. To get there, once again, it comes back to the barriers. It comes back to safety. So how do we build safer vehicles? How do we build safer infrastructure? How do we educate users and non-users? And then around pricing. And on the pricing, we have already seen that a couple of years ago we started with what was more of a consumer grade vehicle that was expensive to operate. The user experience was so. Already now we have been able to cut our operational costs per ride with 70-80%. We will continue to do so with the implementation of kind of more predictive maintenance, more autonomous technologies. I think in a couple of years we will see micromobility vehicles that basically rebalance themselves to a parking hub, to a charging station, inductive charging, recharging themselves, driving down operational cost even more, making it possible for us to give that back to users and drive the cost down further. So we're super excited about the future. We have a lot of technology on our roadmap that will both create a safer experience and also a cheaper experience.
Great, thank you. So Isabel, coming to you now. Fredrik's painted a vision that I absolutely love about micromobility over the next 5 or 10 years, perhaps replacing an enormous number of journeys that are maybe currently made by private car and by less environmentally friendly modes. But to achieve that, we're going to need to see services that are extremely inclusive. And I'd love to hear your views on designing and operating very inclusive micromobility services, and what you think the respective roles of cities and operators should be here.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and I think, as Fredrik knows, the We have to remember, if we look at this from the city perspective, before this sort of explosion of new business models, new technologies, they didn't maybe feel there was a problem that needed to be solved, right? You know, here I've got my public transport network, I might have something on cycling. And so the reaction in many cities has been to feel under threat, to feel that their demand for public transport is being cannibalized by some of these new services. And therefore, the more successful the more successful new mobility providers that we've seen are the ones that actually kind of start from the premise of like understanding where the city's coming from. What's the challenge that the city sees? How can this be additive to what the city has, not, you know, some zero-sum game where we're taking people out of bus? That whole question has now become much sharper in the post-COVID era, and that ridership not coming back. So this fear of these new mobility providers actually growing in many cases. So how do we actually see the partnership between the two providers and how actually together we can service neighborhood demand and shorter distance journeys, which actually traditional public transport networks are not good at servicing? You know, fundamentally, a tube network, a bus network isn't going to be able to do that. So cities need to go through almost like a bit of an emotional journey to kind of accept that there is a collaboration here and that together we can solve all aspects of the challenges that the city confronts. So what is important, I think, for the new providers, for the operators of the new services, is to almost, you know, start from that lens rather than the, I've got an amazing service and I'm here to just jam it into your city, you're going to love it. Because often that creates a kind of bad reaction from the city, you know, let's say leaders, the kind of bureaucracy, whatever you want to call it. So it's about using also data about what is the unmet transport need, where are those congestion problems, where are also issues around equity and access to the public transport network, people who don't have cars but also don't have good public transport provision, and how do, you know, VOI and others, you know, fill that gap for the city rather than just, you know, I'm bringing e-scooters, you're going to love them, never mind what your problems are, which is often the stance that some of those providers take, obviously not VOI.
Great, thanks Isabel. So I want to move on and just talk a little bit about infrastructure and sustainability. Fredrik, maybe starting with you. Unlike conventional push bikes, e-scooters and e-bikes need to be charged. Could you tell me a bit about how VOI approaches charging?
Yep. So early on, with the consumer grade vehicles we were operating that I mentioned, we had to take them in pretty much every day, recharge them, and then put them back on the streets again. At the same time, at VOI, we set up a target day one that we should become carbon neutral in our operations as soon as possible in all our markets. But yeah, we realized that on the operation side, it was both on the product side. So what kind of carbon footprint does our products bring? And then also on the operations side, kind of the actual charging and the rebalancing and maintenance and so on. Around a year and a half ago, we moved over to, instead of fixed battery technology, swappable battery technology. So instead of moving the vehicles in and out every day, 20-25 kilo vehicles, we instead move batteries in and out every day now and swap the batteries there out on the streets. The batteries are 3-4 kilos or something like that. So just the delta in just volume we're moving went down with 90% overnight pretty much. We reached our first carbon neutral city when it comes to operations in Paris, January 2020, and by now all but one or two of more than 60 markets are carbon neutral we've achieved carbon neutrality in operations, and it continues to be one of the central things for us. Once again, back to the vision, cities made for living, free from noise and pollution. We cannot be a polluting factor in the city with that vision and mission, I think. So that's on the operations and product side. Then we have another super important topic, that's modal shift for us. So the trips we're actually making, what kinds of trips do we replace? And it's still early, but we're starting to have a lot of data points from shared e-scooter providers, shared e-bike providers now around the world. And we see that depending on what city you're looking at, say the numbers we see are usually from 10-12% up to 35-40% of our trips replacing car or taxi trips. So that's good, I think, and we see it's increasing every year as our service improves, but still a long way to go.
Great, thanks. And Isabel, moving on to you, we're seeing, so we're talking about electric scooters and electric bikes here, but we're also seeing, as you know, greater electrification across all sorts of modes of road transport. Cars are the one that are in the news on almost a daily or a weekly basis at the moment, vans as well, and then potentially maybe even some heavy goods vehicles in the future. How is this going to change how land is valued and used?
So I think, I mean, you know, there's space for all of these things in the city. I think that's less of the issue, the land question. As you know, every square meter in a city is hotly contested, whether that's between mobility modes or mobility and other purposes. So it's more of a, you know, you can't overstate the politics around every square meter of space. So it needs political will to get some of these changes to happen at the scale that you're talking about there, Lucy. So I guess that's, you know, one thing just worth being aware of. It's not like you just roll up and say, you know, as everyone knows, you know, oh, I just want to put this over here. So having that political will is critical, but there is the space. So that's not the fundamental issue. One of the big challenges that we see with cities all around the world is that the electricity providers, particularly around that kind of last mile distribution, are themselves sometimes a bit uninformed about what the electricity demand is going to be that this is going to generate. They're quite anxious about it. And so they tell the city players, you know, oh my gosh, you know, you definitely can't do this because the network just can't handle it. And that is typically not the case. But because the city doesn't know any better, you end up in this sort of unhelpful kind of, you know, standoff where the electricity provider is saying, no way we can handle large scale electrification. City doesn't have any better information. And it ends up in this sort of, you know, not very useful debate because it's not a very informed debate. So there's a role for data, for information. You know, obviously it's great for consultants because you can go in there and help mediate that conversation. But actually, you know, that is a role for, you know, some of the new mobility providers are starting to recognize they need to kind of help intermediate and inform that conversation and bring some, you know, actual, you know, analysis to the table that demonstrates that this isn't a major barrier, but it is definitely a major perceived barrier. So I think in the next couple of years, that will be the kind of next hump that we need to get over.
That's really interesting. Thanks. And Fredrik, when you're bringing voice service to a new city, what are the most important infrastructure requirements to support a safe and a reliable service in your view?
I think the short answer is more protected bike lanes. That's kind of the for us what it all comes down to: more protected bike lanes, and then a good parking infrastructure. And good parking infrastructure, we're starting to see examples of kind of good parking infrastructure for micromobility. I'm talking about in several cities, including in the UK, including in Paris. I think Paris is probably the best example on the parking and the protected bike lane side. Over the last year, I think Paris has remade around 600 kilometers of car lanes to bike lanes, basically just putting up kind of a concrete barrier where there were car lanes before, which of course makes cycling and e-scooting and e-biking much safer. And then on the parking side, what Paris has done is remaking 2,500 car parking spots to what they call the micromobility hubs. So parking spots for bikes, scooters, e-bikes, and so on. And I would say those two things, so more protected lanes for bikes, for scooters, for e-bikes, for other light vehicles, and then dedicated parking spots. And I think that's crucial. And back to what Isabel said as well on public transit and so on, where we see our services working best is in those cities where the public transit system is, or some areas are very underserved by public transit. There are these kind of transportation desert zones, as we call them. And as I see it, we should probably become a part of public transportation in a couple of years, because we're basically serving the citizens of the city with this, somewhat the same service. It should be a safe, cheap, easy way to get around. We're just solving it not with a bus, not with a tube, but with an e-bike, with an e-scooter, and so on. So I think we will definitely see the world moving in that direction, which we are very, very supportive of.
Thanks.
I just wanted to come in on that quickly, Lucy, because I totally agree with that. And I think the cities are still going through this kind of change in their mindset, right? That, actually we can use this as opposed to be fearful of it. And actually that requires new people within the cities who have a different way of thinking about these problems and new data. So it's actually kind of, thinking about it from a, these are the gaps in the solution space. And I wouldn't say any city is really on the front foot yet on that, really thinking strategically, where do we want these players to fill the gaps for us over the next 10 to 15 years? So that's the kind of next horizon, I would say. Yeah. Sorry, Lucy.
Thanks.
Yeah, I agree. And I just want to fill in with one thing there. No, never mind. Leave it. I'll get back to it later.
Save it for the end. The brilliant thought. We're going to save it for the end. Yeah.
Yeah. We'll save it later.
Maybe just following up on the comments about Fredrik's comments about Paris, Isabel. I'm really interested. Obviously, if someone's designing a new city, it's very easy to design in this kind of infrastructure from scratch with a blank sheet of paper approach. But how easy is it in practice for maybe very older, dense urban environments, such as cities like Paris? How easy is it to replicate that kind of infrastructure elsewhere? Because I know, Paris is a very interesting example because there's been very strong political will to support active travel in Paris. And I'd love to know your thoughts on how we do this for our other very traditional, historic, dense environments.
I mean, it's broadly speaking, it's totally doable, but it does require political will. I mean, when we put in the cycle lanes, for example, on the embankment, I mean, literally we had to argue about almost every meter along that, several kilometers. The politics were unbelievable. And that's especially true when you're starting off, right? Once you've got like 100 kilometers, then everyone goes, oh, right, okay, I just, sort of slightly accept defeat here. And I think broadly, globally, that argument's kind of been won. I would say 10 years ago, people are like, well, protected cycle lanes are fine, but also unprotected cycle lanes are fine. And that has sort of really moved on quite significantly. So I think there's an acceptance, in our community that needs to happen, but that isn't the lived reality out on the ground because politically it's quite difficult. One thing I would say on that is that, so you do need political leadership, but the other thing is that's quite underexploited is the fact that most road traffic operations systems can do a lot more than we're getting them to do at the moment. So, traffic light systems are often not really utilized in a very sophisticated way. So one of the things that we did when we brought in the cycle lanes in London, and we do a lot of work with clients now about that, is if you actually optimize the operations of the system, you can get 10, 15, 20% extra capacity out of the system. So what that means, because you're being more, responsive, more real time, more agile in the timings of traffic lights, really basic stuff, but it's not being utilized around the world. Hundreds of cities just simply aren't doing this. So what does that mean? It means that rather than I'm going to take Fredrik's square meter of space, right? He's driving his car, but I'm going to drive my bike. And then it becomes this, battle. There's actually new space that you can create, space and time, right? Within the system, you're creating a bigger pipe. And when you have that, then you can allocate all the new pipe space to the cyclist. So there is something here about not just focusing on the tarmac. It's also thinking about the timings. All the constraints in the road network are at junctions. That's the fundamental issue. So if we can create more capacity at junctions, we can get more throughput, and the impact on traffic from dedicated lanes for e-scooters and cycles, et cetera, is much less. And therefore, you don't only get the cities that have the political will, you can get the cities that have a lot less political will because it's a lot easier to bring in that capacity. So that's a kind of very underexplored area that needs a lot more focus, in my view. And the other thing I would just say quickly is data is really key here. One of the big problems in pushing the cycling agenda historically has been, transport planners don't count cyclists. They, twice a year, you go out to a few junctions, see how many people cycle by for a couple of hours. If it's raining, then, we didn't have very many cyclists this year. And that is actually what happens. We used to, in London, we were counting, I think twice a year, that went up to 4 times a year at 500 junctions, and there's 5,000 junctions in London. So it was very, very limited what we actually understood. So then when you say to people, oh, we built this cycle lane, it's brilliant, loads of people are using it, everyone goes, well, that's not true. I didn't see anyone on it this morning. So you have to underpin this debate with data. And that's an area where actually people like VOI can really help, because you actually know where everyone's going with the e-scooters, whereas somebody's individual bicycle, there's still issues around data collection in that space. So that is needed to sustain the political will, because you've got to see the user base growing, the demand going up. And that is still a gap, I would say, in the space, still nascent, let's put it that way.
That's really very interesting. Thank you. Moving on to regulation and competition, Fredrik, I'd love to hear from you about the different approaches that you're seeing cities adopt here when it comes to regulating e-scooters and e-bikes, and how you think that's going to unfold over the next few years.
So, on a high level, we see really two types of market, and then we have UK. So 3 types of markets in total. So overall, we see that. So we run shared vehicles where we are the owners and we operate the vehicles and responsible for them and so on. So we see the regulated markets. So where we need to have a contract, a license, an agreement with the city to operate. That contract stipulates things around parking, around the number of vehicles, operational requirements we need to fulfill and so on. Then we have free markets where we don't have any contracts, licenses, and so on with the cities, rather some kind of lightweight memorandum of our understanding or similar. So 2 types of markets. And everywhere outside of the UK, the rules are quite similar for e-scooters and e-bikes, shared ones and rental ones. They are classified as bikes usually, so same rules as for bikes. In the UK, we see a difference where currently shared, so rental e-scooters are allowed, while private ones are not allowed. And that creates a lot of confusion, of course, for I think a lot of people, including the police. So take a city like Birmingham, where we are operating. It's allowed for us to operate and it's allowed to use our vehicles in Birmingham, but it's not allowed to have your own e-scooter currently. I think what we've seen over the years is that a couple of years ago, when we came to market with these scooters first, it was something new. It was a lot of discussions. Is this good? Should this be allowed at all in cities? Now that discussion has definitely changed into rather a pull from cities and countries that, we need these scooters, we need e-bikes for a green recovery after COVID, to hit our green plans for 2030 and so on. So now the discussions with cities and countries are more around kind of how can we together work and how can we together optimize e-scooter and e-bike operations in our city, in Birmingham, in Munich, in Hamburg, and so on. How many operators should we have? What should the rules be? And so on. So I would say we're a much more kind of stable and forward-looking, optimistic regulatory environment today than a couple of years ago when everything was new and it was a bit shaky.
And just as a follow-up question on that for you and for Isabel, how should we think about competition here when it comes to these services? Is it better for cities to focus on developing very deep long-term relationships with maybe 1 or 2 operators, or actually to work with a wider number of operators, but maybe contemplate the possibility of those being slightly more transient relationships?
I've a lot of data points from different setups out there in Europe. And what I've landed in over the years, we have been in cities where it's completely free competition. And for micromobility, for shared micromobility, there are negative externalities that get amplified with the free competition, venture capital backed companies and so on. So we're fond believers in and strong believers in regulation, good regulations. We think it's best for the city and it's best for the operator if it's 1 or max 2 operators per city, and build those long-term relationships to really solve and go into a partnership, because what the cities want are more around safety, sustainability, parking, good order, and so on, while what the users want is more around a good user experience, availability, reliability, good price, and so on. And what we have seen over the years is that it's definitely better for both the cities and the users and the operator, where it's one or two companies building a long-term relationship.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I mean, I think the premise should be anyone can come into the market, but as you said, good regulation, right? Is like, but our bar is high. You know, we want these things out of the relationship, and therefore the outcome is that you only have 1, 2, max 3 providers, even though in principle it's open to everyone. And I think that's the kind of ideal model that we would want to get to. I was just going to add one other thing, Lucy, which is just around the sort of integration of services, and how do we get ourselves to that place that, you know, we want to get to, which is a more integrated strategic approach that Fredrik's referring to there. And this sort of rise in interest, in more serious interest again in road pricing and cross-modal mobility pricing, something I've been involved in for 20 years, and everyone sort of always thinks they can't do it because it's too politically difficult, and it's always one of these like sort of religious tropes that, you know, get brought out in transport planning all the time. But actually in the last year, we've seen a big change in the market of people looking at this much more seriously now. Just if I look at our clients, whether that's at the national level or the city level. So I think there's a really interesting question here about how we think about if we're moving into that space more rapidly and more seriously now, partly because a lot of governments are confronting the fact that the fuel duty is evaporating because they have greener and cleaner vehicles, so they have to make the leap, you know, sooner rather than later. What is the role of pricing and helping to create the right incentives for new providers to go to the right place, do the right thing, serve the right parts of the city, and that the price point is right relative to the public transport offer? So a more kind of, let's say, lightly coordinated, but, you know, a view where the pricing is actually driven off the strategic outcomes that the city's after. And I think it'll be really useful for the new mobility providers to kind of get into that space with governments and cities, because, you know, often within the cities and within government bureaucracies, you've got people who've been hearing about this for 20 years. They think it's not real, it's never going to happen, and, you know, it's all too politically challenging. Whereas actually the new providers have a much more retail and consumer focused perspective on it, which is actually, you know, people pay more for things all the time, as long as they feel they're getting a service in exchange. So I actually might want to pay for road use if I felt like in exchange I was getting a higher quality service. And so if we kind of use that lens on it, rather than, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm thinking about road pricing and it's a tax and I apologize, then I think that's a kind of perspective that the new mobility providers can really bring into the industry and really shake things up a bit in that space specifically, which will also lead to better strategic outcomes for the cities.
Yeah, and I think back to what Isabel said as well, I've more and more recently just gone deeper in public transportation and tried to understand why things look like they are. And it seems like there is an opportunity, back to what Isabel said there, on data. And imagine like a public transportation 3.0 or 4.0 provider starting bottom up, more like software data driven from day one, aggregating all data sources from new mobility providers for public transportation, from the city's own data and so on. And from that, really looking at kind of how could we build the best possible public transportation in 5 or 7 years from now, from a kind of more software data-driven approach rather than a top-down regulations, like here we have a bus that needs to drive this line 2 times or 3 times an hour type of perspective, which is something I've gotten more and more interested in.
Yeah, it's like system centered. Well, don't worry, Lucy, we're moving into your next topic. But I think, totally, you know, we need to remind ourselves that cities do not know if you drove your car on Monday, you took the bus on Tuesday, and you cycled on Wednesday. They don't know that the person who took the bus on Tuesday is the same person as the person who drove their car on Monday. That data is not held, even in the most sophisticated cities. So when you talk about modal shift, understanding the much more complex usage that we actually have as individuals, we're not all just bus users or just walkers or whatever it might be. This is not information that the city has. It tries to kind of cobble it together in a very aggregated, very generalized way, which doesn't reflect real patterns in the city at all. So we are doing a lot more work at the moment on agent-based modeling and actually trying to use some of the new data sources that can help to inform exactly what Fredrik's talking about. But that is even a sophisticated city like New York, Hong Kong, Singapore, London. don't have that kind of data. And that's that world that you're talking about isn't going to be possible until we actually start to bring those data sources together. They don't have to be held in a single place, right? But it's about kind of looking across, all the different movement that's happening and connecting it back to the individual.
Great, thank you. So we're almost at time. We did start a little bit late, so I'm going to take just a final couple of minutes. Final comment from each of you, I think. Isabel, I'd love to know, what do you think is the kind of 1 or 2 low or no regrets actions that cities should and could be taking right now to future-proof the urban realm for future mobility, future developments in mobility? Fredrik, I'd love to know, just in 30 seconds, the top 3 things you've learned about how to successfully introduce micromobility to cities. I'll go to Isabel first.
I think I'm just going to use this opportunity to answer a different question, which is, even before COVID, the underlying business model that transport is run on in cities was creaking, partly because of the rise of mobility providers from elsewhere, partly because, people's movement patterns are changing. That 1950s style pumping in and out of the city anymore. COVID's just brought all of that to life even more strongly. There is a need to totally rethink the business model for transport in cities. And it's not kind of optional, because just, large levels of government subsidy that now need to be even larger for the next, 5, 10, 20 years in order to, kind of prop up a concept that was developed decades ago is not the way forward. So there is going to need to be an acceptance that there is a new approach that needs to build on the past, but integrate a lot of the new providers, and that has a much more sort of fluid, flexible, agile, and partnership-based approach to delivering transport in cities. And hopefully COVID can help to kind of accelerate that rather than sort of scare everyone back into, 1970, wherever.
And Fredrik,
no pressure, Fredrik. Can you just help reinvent the entire business model for urban transport? That'd be great.
No, I'd say I will come. My answer would be around the thing we have talked about now. What we have learned, 3 things is data, data, data. We have been so surprised in many cities how well it's working. Say in the UK, like a city like Northampton, one of our best cities for several months throughout this year on utilization. We didn't expect that. Stockholm. Cold in the winter, but people are used to riding bikes in the winter anyway, so they're using e-scooters and shared e-bikes as well. So just going back to that, being data-driven, I think, is key to a lot of things, and especially in transportation, because there are so many kind of old, they're just old beliefs and facts out there that aren't really right and are kind of ripe for disruption.
Great. Well, Isabel and Fredrik, thank you both so much. We could have talked a lot longer, I'm sure, but alas, we are at time now. So thank you both very much for joining. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone who was watching. Bye. And enjoy the rest of the day.